The thunderous boom of an Arizona storm couldn't drown out Margaret Jensen's sobs as she knelt before the tiny wooden cross, her fingers tracing the freshly carved name. Emma Jensen, beloved daughter, 1873–1878. The rain soaked through her black mourning dress, plastering it against her trembling form, but Margaret felt nothing except the hollow ache where her heart used to be. Arizona Territory, 1878. A place where life bloomed with difficulty and withered with ease. Margaret had learned this truth in the cruelest way possible. "You shouldn't be out here in this weather, madam." A deep voice called over the rainfall. Margaret didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the intrusion. Her world had narrowed to this small mound of earth that held everything she'd loved. Heavy boots squelched in the mud, coming closer. A large figure crouched beside her, and a worn leather duster appeared above her head, sheltering her from the downpour. "Been watching you from the ridge. You've been here since sunrise." Margaret finally lifted her gaze, meeting the weathered face of a man she'd seen around town but never spoken to. His eyes were the color of the storm-dark sky, his face bronzed and lined from years under the harsh frontier sun. A horseman, a drifter, maybe one of the many cowboys who passed through Copper Springs. "My business is my own," she managed, her voice hoarse from crying. He nodded, respectful but unflinching. "Name's William Brannigan. I lost my sister's boy to the fever 2 winters back." "Saw her grieve like you're grieving now." Margaret looked back at the small grave. "Then you know nothing helps, nothing changes this." "Not today," he agreed, keeping the duster steady above her. "Not tomorrow either, but you'll heal beside me one day if you choose to." Margaret's head snapped up, anger flashing through her grief. "How dare you? I don't know you, and my child isn't even cold in the ground." William Brannigan's expression remained gentle. "I'm not asking for anything, madam, just offering a promise that the pain won't always feel like this. And when you're ready to believe that, I'll still be here. You'll be long gone like all the cowboys," she said bitterly. He shook his head. "Not me. I've bought the old Thompson place. I'm staying." As if to punctuate his words, the rain suddenly intensified, turning the cemetery into a sea of mud. William stood, offering his hand. "Let me see you home safely, Mrs. Jensen, Margaret Jensen." She hesitated, then reluctantly placed her fingers in his calloused palm. "The widow Jensen." William helped her to her feet with surprising gentleness for a man of his size. "The storm's getting worse. Emma wouldn't want you catching your death out here." At the mention of her daughter's name, Margaret felt fresh tears well up. "How did you—" "I helped the preacher dig the grave yesterday," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Jensen, truly." She didn't respond, but allowed him to escort her from the cemetery, his duster still shielding her from the worst of the rain. They walked in silence through the muddy streets of Copper Springs, a mining town that had seen better days since the copper veins had started running thin. When they reached the small clapboard house at the edge of town, Margaret paused at the gate. "Thank you, Mr. Brannigan." He tipped his hat. "Will you be all right alone?" "I've been alone since my husband died 2 years ago," she replied, the words hollow. "I managed then, I'll manage now." William studied her face. "The offer stands, not today, not tomorrow, but someday the healing will come." Margaret turned away without answering, unable to imagine a future beyond her grief. The thought of healing felt like a betrayal of Emma's memory. How could a mother ever recover from burying her child? She entered her empty house, the silence deafening after Emma's absence. Her daughter's toys still scattered the floor where she'd left them before the fever had taken hold 3 days ago. Margaret collapsed into a chair, staring at the small rag doll Emma had loved so dearly. Outside, William Brannigan stood in the rain for a long moment, watching the house before turning toward the livery where his horse waited. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had never happened. Margaret rose from her bed, having barely slept, and dressed mechanically. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had brought food yesterday, but Margaret hadn't touched it. Eating seemed pointless now. A knock at the door startled her. Opening it, she found William Brannigan standing on her porch, hat in hand. "Mr. Brannigan," she said flatly, "what do you want?" "Good morning, Mrs. Jensen. I brought you some fresh bread from the bakery." He held out a cloth-wrapped parcel. "And I wanted to ask if you might need any repairs around your place. storm did some damage in town. Margaret wanted to refuse to send him away, but she noticed the corner of her roof had indeed been damaged by the wind. With Emma's medical bills and funeral costs, she couldn't afford to hire someone. "I can't pay you," she said. "Wasn't looking to be paid," he replied, "just being neighborly." Margaret hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. The roof, then, and a window in back that won't latch properly. William spent the morning repairing her roof while Margaret sat inside, trying to summon the energy to tidy Emma's things. Each toy, each small dress she touched brought fresh waves of pain. By midday, she'd managed to place a few items in a box, but most remained where Emma had left them. When William came inside to fix the window, he worked quietly, respecting her silence. Only when he finished did he speak. "You ought to eat something, Mrs. Jensen." "I'm not hungry," he nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Still, the body needs sustenance even when the heart's not in it." He unwrapped the bread he'd brought, breaking off a piece and offering it to her. After a moment, Margaret took it, nibbling without tasting. "What was she like?" William asked softly. "Your Emma," Margaret nearly choked on the bread. No one had asked her that. Everyone in town had known Emma, had offered condolences, but no one had asked Margaret to speak about her daughter. "She was." Margaret struggled, the words catching. "She laughed all the time, found joy in everything. Even when times were hard after my husband died, she'd find something to smile about." A tear slipped down her cheek. She wanted to be a schoolteacher someday. William listened, his face solemn. "Sounds like she had your strength." "She was stronger than I'll ever be," Margaret whispered. "I don't know how to go on without her." "One breath at a time," William said simply. "That's all any of us can do." He left soon after, promising to return the next day to fix her front steps, which had begun to rot. Margaret found herself standing at the window, watching his broad shoulders as he walked away, wondering why a stranger would show such kindness. True to his word, William returned the next day and the day after that. Each time he brought something small, fresh eggs from his new farm, a jar of honey, a bunch of wildflowers. He never stayed long, never pushed for conversation, but always asked one question about Emma before he left. What games did she like to play? What was her favorite color? What stories did she enjoy? Each question was like pressing on a bruise, painful yet somehow releasing. Margaret found herself looking forward to these moments, these chances to speak Emma's name aloud, to share memories of her daughter with someone who hadn't known her but wanted to. A week passed, then two. Margaret finally packed away Emma's things, keeping out only the rag doll and a drawing Emma had made of their house with the two of them standing hand in hand outside. She placed these on the mantel, a shrine to what she'd lost. She began to venture out again, first just to the general store for necessities, then to church on Sundays. William was often there, sitting toward the back, nodding respectfully but never imposing himself. Once when Mrs. Patterson commented loudly about "that poor widow Jensen looking better," William had smoothly changed the subject, drawing attention away from Margaret's discomfort. One afternoon in late June, Margaret found herself walking to the cemetery again. The small grave now had grass growing over it, and wildflowers had sprung up around the wooden cross. She was kneeling to clear away some weeds when she heard familiar footsteps. "Those are pretty," William said, nodding to the wildflowers. "Natural bouquet for her." Margaret brushed soil from her hands. "Did you plant these?" He shook his head. "Nature has its own way of bringing beauty back to sorrowful places." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, the summer breeze rustling through the cottonwoods that edged the cemetery. "Would you like to see my place?" William asked suddenly. "The Thompson farm, I've made some improvements." Margaret was surprised by the invitation and more surprised by her desire to accept. Yes, I think I would." William's horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding, carried them both to his farm, 3 miles outside of town. The old Thompson place had been abandoned for years after the family moved back east. What had once been a dilapidated homestead was now showing signs of careful restoration. The house had a fresh coat of whitewash, the barn roof had been repaired, and a vegetable garden flourished behind a new fence. Chickens pecked in a newly built coop, and 2 milk cows grazed in the pasture. "You've done all this yourself?" Margaret asked, impressed despite herself. Had some help from the Martinez brothers for the barn raising, William admitted. But mostly, yes. He helped her down from the horse, his hands strong and steady at her waist. He showed her around proudly, pointing out his plans for expanding the orchard and adding more livestock. Land's good here, water's plentiful from the creek, could be a fine place for a family someday. Margaret felt a pang at the word family, but it wasn't as sharp as it once would have been. "Why did you leave cattle driving to become a farmer?" she asked. William's eyes grew distant. "Spent 15 years on the trail, seen enough trouble and strife to last a lifetime, wanted something that grows instead of something that ends." He paused. "After my sister's boy died, I started thinking about putting down roots, having something that lasts." Margaret nodded, understanding the desire to create something permanent in a world where everything could be taken away so suddenly. William made coffee on his wood stove, and they sat on his porch as the sun began to set, painting the Arizona sky in brilliant oranges and purples. For the first time since Emma's death, Margaret felt a moment of peace. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything you've done." William looked surprised. "Haven't done much. You've been kind when you didn't have to be. You've listened. You've remembered her with me." His eyes softened. "Emma deserves to be remembered, and you deserve kindness, Margaret." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something fluttered in her chest at the sound of it on his lips. The ride back to town was quiet, both lost in their thoughts. When they reached her house, William helped her down, his hands lingering a moment longer than necessary. "I'd like to call on you properly," he said, "if you'd permit it." Margaret felt a rush of conflicting emotions, guilt at the thought of finding happiness after Emma, fear of caring for someone who might be taken from her, and underneath it all, a small, persistent hope. "I'm not ready," she admitted, "but perhaps someday." William nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Someday is all I ask for." As summer turned to fall, William became a regular visitor to Margaret's home. They established a routine. Sunday afternoons after church he would come for coffee, sometimes bringing small gifts. A book he thought she might enjoy, honey from his new beehives, apples from his orchard. They would talk, sometimes about Emma, sometimes about William's years on the cattle trails, sometimes about the town gossip. Margaret learned that William had been born in Missouri, had fought briefly for the Union in the final year of the Civil War when he was barely 18. And had spent the years since moving westward, working cattle drives from Texas to Montana. He'd never married, though there had been a girl back in Kansas who'd chosen a banker over a cowboy. "Can't blame her," William said without bitterness. "Banking's a sight more stable than pushing longhorns." Margaret told him about growing up in Pennsylvania, meeting her husband Jacob at a church social, and their decision to move west when the copper mines were booming. She spoke of Jacob's death in a mining accident, how she'd struggled to keep their home and raise Emma alone. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known," William told her one evening as they sat on her porch watching the sunset. Margaret shook her head. "I'm broken inside, William. I'm not sure that can ever be fixed." "Broken doesn't mean weak," he replied. "Sometimes it means you've been tested beyond what most could bear, and you're still standing." His words stayed with her long after he'd gone. That night, she took out Emma's rag doll, holding it close as tears came, not the desperate, wrenching sobs of fresh grief, but a gentler sorrow that acknowledged both her loss and her continued existence. The first frost came early that year. Margaret woke to find her garden covered in a delicate white sheen. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside, marveling at how the world could still create such beauty. A movement caught her eye. William, riding toward her house, his breath and his horses creating plumes of vapor in the cold morning air. He wasn't due to visit until Sunday, 2 days away. "William," she called, confused by his unexpected appearance. He dismounted quickly, his face grave. "There's a situation in town, Margaret. Thought you should know before you heard it elsewhere." "What's happened?" Alarm spread through her. "The Reynolds gang, they've been spotted near Copper Springs." William's expression was grim. "Sheriff's organizing a posse. They robbed the bank in Tucson last week, killed 2 men." Margaret had heard of the Reynolds brothers, 3 outlaws who had terrorized southern Arizona for the past year, robbing banks and stagecoaches with brutal efficiency. Will you join the posse? She asked, suddenly afraid for him. William nodded. Sheriff asked for men who can ride and shoot. I can do both. Margaret felt a cold that had nothing to do with the frost. When do you leave? Hours time. Wanted to make sure you were warned. Best stay in town until we're back. You're too isolated out here. I'll be fine, Margaret insisted. I have Jacob's old rifle, William frowned. Margaret, these men are dangerous. They wouldn't hesitate. I've lived alone for years, William. I know how to take care of myself. His expression softened. I know you do. But it would ease my mind if you stayed with Mrs. Patterson until this is over. Something in his tone, the genuine concern, the care touched Margaret deeply. All right, she conceded. I'll pack a few things. Relief flooded his face. Thank you. He hesitated, then stepped closer, taking her hand in his. I'll be back soon. Margaret felt the warmth of his rough palm against hers, saw something in his eyes that made her heart beat faster. Be careful, William. Impulsively, she leaned forward and pressed a kiss to his cheek. His skin was cold from the morning air but warmed quickly under her lips. When she pulled back, his eyes had darkened, and his hand tightened on hers. I have something to come back for now, he said softly. The posse departed that morning, 10 men riding out of Copper Springs with determination on their faces and rifles strapped to their saddles. Margaret watched from Mrs. Patterson's front window, her eyes fixed on William's broad shoulders until he disappeared from view. He's sweet on you, Mrs. Patterson observed, bringing a cup of tea. Half the widows in town have set their caps for William Brannigan since he bought the Thompson place, but he only has eyes for you. Margaret felt her cheeks warm. We're friends. He's been kind during a difficult time. Mrs. Patterson snorted. Kind, is it? Man doesn't ride 3 miles into town every other day just to be kind, dear. Margaret couldn't deny the flutter in her stomach whenever William appeared, or how she found herself watching the clock on Sundays, anticipating his arrival. But the guilt remained. How could she find happiness when Emma couldn't? It's too soon, she murmured. Mrs. Patterson's weathered face softened. Life goes on, Margaret. Emma would want that for you. The posse was gone for 3 days. 3 days of Margaret pacing Mrs. Patterson's parlor, jumping at every sound from the street, scanning the horizon for riders. 3 nights of fitful sleep, dreaming of Emma one moment and William the next, waking confused and guilty. On the morning of the 4th day, shots rang out at the edge of town. Margaret rushed to the window to see riders approaching the posse returning, but something was wrong. Men were slumped in their saddles, others riding double. They're hurt, she gasped, grabbing her shawl and running for the door. Margaret, wait, Mrs. Patterson called, but Margaret was already racing down the street toward the commotion. The town gathered as the posse arrived. Sheriff Taylor was bleeding from his arm, his face grim. 2 men were laid across their horses, unmoving. Margaret's heart seized as she scanned the faces, looking for William. We got 2 of them, the sheriff announced. Luke and Matthew Reynolds. 3rd one got away, but he's wounded. Our losses, someone called out. Jim Bartlett and Pete Simmons didn't make it, Sheriff Taylor said, removing his hat in respect. Doc needs to see to the wounded right away. Margaret pushed through the crowd, panic rising as she still couldn't find William. Finally, at the back of the group, she spotted him alive but hunched in his saddle, his shirt dark with blood. William, she cried, running to his horse. He looked down at her, his face pale beneath his tan. Margaret, he managed before starting to slide from the saddle. Margaret caught him as best she could, staggering under his weight until others rushed to help. Together they carried William to Doc Wilson's office, laying him on a table as the doctor hurried to assess his wounds. Bullet went clean through his shoulder, Doc Wilson announced after examination. Missed anything vital, but he's lost a fair amount of blood. Will he be all right? Margaret asked, clutching William's hand. Doc Wilson nodded. With rest and care, no riding or heavy lifting for a few weeks. Relief washed over her, followed by determination. I'll take care of him. The doctor raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Jensen, that wouldn't be proper, hang propriety, Margaret snapped. He has no family here and his farm needs tending. I can nurse him there and see to the animals. A weak chuckle came from William. No arguing with her, Doc. Strongest woman in the territory. Margaret moved William to his farm that same day with help from some of the townsmen. She established herself in his spare room and took over the running of the household and farm chores with quiet efficiency. William protested at first. "This isn't right, Margaret. Your reputation, let people talk," she said firmly, changing the bandage on his shoulder. "I'm too old to care about gossip." 30 is hardly old, he argued with a smile. Ancient by frontier standards, she retorted. Now hush and drink your broth. The days fell into a new rhythm. Margaret rose early to feed the chickens and milk the cows before preparing breakfast. She changed William's bandages, forced medicines on him when he was stubborn, and read to him in the evenings from a worn copy of The Last of the Mohicans she'd found on his shelf. As William regained his strength, he began to help with small tasks, sitting at the kitchen table to shell peas or polish tack while Margaret worked. They talked more freely now, sharing stories and dreams, laughing together in a way Margaret hadn't thought possible again after Emma's death. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, William turned to her with serious eyes. "Why did you come to care for me, Margaret? Truth now," she considered the question. "Because you would have done the same for me, because you remembered Emma with me when others wanted me to forget." "Because," she hesitated, then met his gaze directly, "because the thought of losing you frightened me more than I could bear." William reached for her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I've loved you since I saw you kneeling in that cemetery, strong even in your deepest grief." Margaret's breath caught. "William, let me finish," he said gently. "I know you're still healing. I know Emma will always be in your heart as she should be, but if you could find room there for me too, I'd count myself the luckiest man alive." Tears filled Margaret's eyes, but they weren't tears of grief. I think there's room," she whispered. "Emma would have liked you, you know. She always wanted a father." William's eyes glistened in the fading light. "I wish I could have known her." "So do I," Margaret said softly. "But I can tell you about her every day if you like." "I'd like that very much." William leaned forward, his hand cupping her cheek with infinite tenderness. "May I kiss you, Margaret Jensen?" In answer, she closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that tasted of new beginnings and the promise of tomorrow. They were married in the small church in Copper Springs as autumn leaves fell around them. The town turned out in full, curious about the romance that had blossomed between the grieving widow and the former cowboy. Mrs. Patterson dabbed at her eyes throughout the ceremony, whispering to anyone who would listen that she'd predicted it all along. Margaret wore a simple blue dress rather than black for the first time since Emma's death. As she spoke her vows, she felt a sense of peace, not forgetting Emma, but honoring her by embracing life again. They settled into William's farm, working side by side to build something lasting. William expanded the orchards and added more livestock, while Margaret started a small kitchen garden and turned the spare bedroom into a cozy sitting room with bookshelves William built himself. The third Sunday of every month, they rode to the cemetery together, placing fresh flowers on Emma's grave and telling her about the farm, the crops, the changing seasons. Sometimes Margaret cried and William held her without speaking. Other times they smiled as they remembered Emma's laugh or recounted a particularly sweet memory. Winter came to Arizona, milder than the Pennsylvania winters of Margaret's youth, but still bringing change to the landscape. On Christmas Eve, they sat before the fire in their snug farmhouse, William carving a small wooden horse while Margaret worked on a quilt. "I have something for you," William said, setting aside his carving. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in tissue paper. Margaret unwrapped it carefully to reveal a locket on a silver chain. Opening it, she gasped. Inside was a tiny portrait of Emma, painted from the daguerreotype Margaret kept on the mantel. "How did you commissioned it from that traveling portrait artist who passed through last month," William explained. "Wanted you to be able to keep her close to your heart always." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks as she fastened the locket around her neck. "It's perfect," she whispered, touching the cool metal reverently. "There's room in there for another picture someday," William said softly. "If we're blessed." Margaret looked up at him, understanding his meaning. "Do you think we might be at my age?" William took her hands in his. "I think anything's possible, Margaret, but even if it's just you and me, that's family enough for me." She leaned into his embrace, feeling truly at home for the first time since losing Emma. And for me, she agreed, but life had more surprises in store. By spring, Margaret's suspicions were confirmed. At 31, she was expecting a child. The news brought both joy and anxiety. The memory of losing Emma was still raw, and the thought of facing that pain again terrified her. William found her one evening sitting on Emma's old rag doll, her face troubled. "What if I can't love this baby properly?" she confessed, her greatest fear finally spoken aloud. "What if I'm too afraid of losing another child?" William sat beside her, taking her hands in his. "Love doesn't work that way, Margaret. Your heart isn't divided, it grows. Your love for Emma doesn't diminish your capacity to love this child, and your love for this baby won't lessen what you feel for her." "I'm scared, William," she whispered. "So am I," he admitted, "but we'll face it together." Every day, every moment. As Margaret's body changed with the growing life inside her, the farm flourished too. William built a nursery adjoining their bedroom, painting the walls a soft yellow. Together they selected a name, Samuel for a boy, after William's father, or Elizabeth for a girl, after Margaret's mother. The summer was hot, making Margaret's last months of pregnancy uncomfortable. William fussed over her constantly, bringing her cool drinks and insisting she rest during the hottest part of the day. "You'll smother me with all this attention," she complained good-naturedly. "Just practicing," he replied with a grin, placing a hand on her rounded belly. "Two to fuss over soon." Elizabeth Jensen Brannigan arrived on a cool September morning in 1879, almost a year to the day after William and Margaret's wedding. She had William's dark hair and Margaret's green eyes, a perfect blend of them both. As Margaret held her daughter for the first time, she felt Emma's presence strongly, not with grief, but with a sense of completion, as if Emma somehow knew and approved of this new sister. "She's beautiful," William murmured, his voice choked with emotion as he stroked the baby's tiny cheek. "Thank you, Margaret." When Elizabeth was 2 weeks old, they took her to visit Emma's grave. Margaret placed a small bouquet of late summer wildflowers on the mound, which was now covered with lush grass. "Emma, this is your sister, Elizabeth," Margaret said softly, holding the baby where she imagined Emma could see her. "I wish you could know each other, I wish." Her voice broke. William's arm came around her shoulders. "She knows," he said with quiet certainty. "Somehow she knows." They stood together in the peaceful cemetery, the family they had become and the child they would always remember. As they turned to leave, Margaret paused, looking back at the small grave with the wildflowers dancing in the breeze. "You were right," she said to William. "That day in the rain when you found me here, you said I'd heal beside you one day. I didn't believe you then." William squeezed her shoulder gently. "And now," Margaret looked down at Elizabeth, sleeping peacefully in her arms, then up at her husband's face, lined with love and patience. "Now I know healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means finding a way to carry the pain alongside the joy." As they walked back toward their wagon, the setting sun cast long shadows before them, 3 shadows where once there had been only one. Margaret felt Emma walking with them, a presence that would always be part of their family story. Their home welcomed them back with the familiar creaks and smells that had become the backdrop of their shared life. William built up the fire while Margaret nursed Elizabeth, both of them content in the quiet routine they had established. "I have something for you," Margaret said when the baby had fallen asleep. She went to the drawer where she kept her sewing and pulled out a small wooden frame. Inside was a drawing, Emma's drawing of their old house, carefully preserved, but now with additions in Margaret's hand. She had extended the original picture, adding the farm with its orchard and barn, and expanded the 2 stick figures to 3, a man, a woman, and a small child. "It's our family," she explained, handing it to William. "All of us." William studied the drawing, his eyes soft with emotion. "It's perfect," he said, his voice husky. He hung it carefully on the wall beside the mantel, where Emma's rag doll still sat as a reminder of the love that had come before. That night, with Elizabeth sleeping in her cradle and the moon casting silver light through the window, Margaret lay in William's arms, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Do you ever think about how differently our lives might have gone?" she asked. "If we hadn't met that day in the cemetery, William was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "I believe some souls are meant to find each other, Margaret, if not that day, then another." "Such a romantic notion from a practical cowboy," she teased gently. He chuckled, the sound rumbling in his chest beneath her ear. "You bring it out in me." "I'm glad you found me that day," Margaret admitted. "Even though I was awful to you, you were grieving," William corrected, "and brave enough to keep breathing despite it. That's when I started falling in love with you." Margaret raised herself on one elbow to look into his face. "When did you know for certain?" William smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "When you kissed my cheek before I rode out with the posse." "I'd been hoping, but that's when I knew there might be a chance." "And I knew when I couldn't find you among the returning riders," Margaret confessed. "When I thought I might have lost you too, that's when I realized my heart had somehow started working again." Their lips met in a tender kiss, full of the understanding that comes from sharing both sorrow and joy. Outside, the wind rustled through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the moon lonely sounds that only emphasized the warmth within. As winter approached again, the farm settled into the rhythms of the season. Elizabeth grew stronger each day, her personality emerging stubborn like her father, observant like her mother, with a laugh that sometimes caught in Margaret's throat for how it echoed Emma's. William expanded the house, adding a larger kitchen and a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. Margaret planted flower beds and climbing roses that would bloom in the spring, creating a home that reflected the blended beauty of their life together. The Reynolds gang was finally captured that winter, the third brother found hiding in a mining camp near the Mexican border. The town of Copper Springs celebrated, and William rode with Margaret and Elizabeth to witness the outlaws being transported to Tucson for trial. "Hard to believe it was only a year ago," William said, touching the scar on his shoulder that still pained him in cold weather. "So much has changed," Margaret agreed, adjusting Elizabeth's blanket against the December chill. As they returned to the farm, snow began to fall, a rare enough occurrence in southern Arizona to seem magical. They stopped the wagon on a rise overlooking their property, watching as the white flakes transformed the landscape. "I never thought I'd be happy again," Margaret said softly, leaning against William's solid warmth. "After Emma, I thought that part of life was over for me." William wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his other hand holding Elizabeth secure. "Life has a way of surprising us, good and bad." "More good than bad these days," Margaret said, looking up at him with a smile. "And more to come," William promised. "We have years ahead of us, Margaret, years to build and grow and love." They continued down the hill toward home, the snow erasing their tracks behind them, but unable to touch the path they had forged together, a path that had begun with grief, but led to something neither could have imagined that rainy day in the cemetery. As they entered their home, shaking snow from their clothes, Margaret caught sight of Emma's rag doll on the mantel and felt a moment of profound gratitude. For the daughter she had loved and lost, for the husband who had helped her find her way back to life, and for the baby now sleeping against her chest, the visible proof that hearts could heal and love again. Elizabeth grew into a curious, lively toddler, filling the farmhouse with laughter and mischief. She inherited William's love of the outdoors and Margaret's stubborn determination, a combination that kept both parents constantly on their toes. By the time she was 3, Elizabeth had a brother, James William Brannigan, born during a summer thunderstorm that reminded Margaret vividly of the day she'd first met William. The family continued to visit Emma's grave monthly, keeping her memory alive through stories and traditions. Elizabeth, though never having known her sister, spoke of Emmy as a familiar presence in their lives. The farm prospered under William and Margaret's care, becoming one of the most successful in the county. William's orchards produced the finest apples in the territory, while Margaret's garden supplied vegetables for their table and extras to sell in town. As their family and farm grew, so did the town of Copper Springs. The railroad arrived in 1883, bringing new settlers and businesses. William served on the town council, helping to establish the first proper school, where Elizabeth would eventually attend. On the 10th anniversary of Emma's death, Margaret walked alone to the cemetery at dawn, as she had that first day. The small grave was now adorned with a proper headstone, Emma's name carved in elegant letters with the words "beloved daughter and sister" beneath. Margaret sat beside the grave, no longer overcome with grief but filled with quiet remembrance. She told Emma about Elizabeth's latest escapades, James's first steps, William's plans to build a larger barn. She spoke as she would to a distant but cherished family member with love, but without the raw pain that had once accompanied Emma's name. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Margaret heard familiar footsteps approaching. William stood a respectful distance away, giving her the space he somehow always knew when she needed it. "I thought I might find you here," he said softly. Margaret smiled, reaching out her hand to him. "Just visiting, catching her up on family news." William joined her beside the grave, placing a small wooden horse similar to the one he'd carved years ago for Elizabeth atop the headstone. "Thought she might like this, been working on it for a while." Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. "She would have loved it, and you." William's arm came around her, solid and reassuring. 10 years, he murmured, "seems both a lifetime and the blink of an eye." "That's how time works when you're building a life," Margaret replied. Looking back, looking forward, it all blends together. They sat in comfortable silence, the morning birds singing around them. After a while, Margaret stood, brushing grass from her skirt. "The children will be awake. Elizabeth promised to help make biscuits this morning." William rose beside her, taking her hand in his. "You know, that day I found you here, I never imagined." He gestured between them, encompassing all they had become to each other. "No," Margaret agreed with a small smile, "neither did I." "I meant what I said, though," William continued, his eyes earnest. "About healing beside me." Margaret squeezed his hand. "You kept your promise, William, every day in 1,000 small ways." As they walked out of the cemetery together, Margaret looked back once at Emma's grave, sunlight now spilling fully across the small headstone and the wooden horse that sat atop it. The pain would never completely vanish. There would always be moments when the absence of her first child cut deep, but alongside that pain now flowed joy, love, and the quiet strength that comes from weathering life's harshest storms and finding beauty in the aftermath. "Ready to go home?" William asked, his voice gentle. Margaret nodded, turning toward their future. "I'm ready." And together, they walked into the golden Arizona morning, toward the family and the life they had built from grief's ashes, a testament to hearts that could break and heal and love again, one day at a time.